Hi folks, this lecture is about energy security, and there's been some extremely interesting and I think very important developments in global energy security that will, I think that there is a very high probability that it will dramatically change not only the energy markets but maybe even the global order itself. So I actually want to start this lecture talking about the global order that has been driven by US security concerns since 1945, and then get back to new technological breakthroughs in the energy field and how that's affecting US energy security and the rest of the world's energy security. So if we were face to face, I would get a class discussion going about what the term autarky, right, and make sure everyone understood the term. That autarky is when states try and have self-sufficiency, at least for strategically important resources. So energy is right up there. But what happens if you don't have the resources you need, and no one will trade them with you? Well, that's actually what used to happen in the age of empires, really. In the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, this is what free trade looked like. So instead of exchanging goods, you would exchange bullets, right? If there was something that your country needed to grow, then or to survive, then you sent warships to find it and get it and bring it back and defend it from being stolen on the way. Right? And you would set up either a colony, or you would bribe and enter into trading relations with local chiefs, and you spread out into an empire. And the empires didn't really trade with each other, not for essentials. And so if an empire was shut out of a vital resource, then these empires would clash. And so this dynamic, this lack of free trade, this dynamic is really the driving force behind empire. It's not as though it's not really, or at least from a geopolitical point of view, right? The urge to spread out into empire that we saw in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries is really about the drive for resources for survival, right? Rather than any classical realist sense of wanting to dominate everyone else and that sort of thing. I'm sure there's all that mixed in there, but from a geopolitical point of view, empire was the only way you secured resources. And eventually, this led to World War II, where the great empires of Europe have all gone to war and conscripted all the rest of the world into the fight. And the devastation of the new technologies of carpet bombing, right, from the air, meant that meant that all of Europe was basically rubble, right? Like completely destroyed. And you can imagine the effort. Oh, and Japan as well, obviously, with the couple of nuclear weapons dropped on them. But actually, what did it as much or more damage was the firebombings through the traditional cities that were made of wood and paper, even, and just tore through Japanese cities terribly. So all the advanced countries were in ruins, and you can just imagine the amount of effort and time and money it would require to rebuild a city, let alone every city. Right? It's just mind-boggling. So that led to the Cold War beginning. Okay, I suppose the next thing I need to bring to your attention is that the Cold War began even before the end of the war, right? And it certainly really began when it became obvious that Russia wasn't going to relinquish control over all the territories that it had taken back from the Nazis. And so with the World War II won, we've immediately stepped into the next one, and so a famous letter that enunciated that made clear the strategy that the US followed for the next 50 years was the long telegram from George Kennan's long telegram, and he was the US ambassador to Russia, and in that long telegram, he describes what is going to be needed to defeat this empire, and it was basically a containment strategy until the internal economics of the system would collapse. Huh? And that's what happened. It was quite amazing. So the other thing that was happening at the end of the Cold War was, at the end of World War II, was a meeting of all countries at Bretton Woods, a resort in, actually I forget which state of the US it was, but very beautiful, big resort hotel, and pretty well every country in the world was represented there. Leaders weren't really part of this. It was more a finance ministers and things like that. But this was the economics of the New Deal. The US said to them all, look, we're the last man standing. The rest of the world has been decimated. No one's got a navy or to speak of. No one's got an economy to speak of except the US. The US's economy was larger than all the rest put together, right? It was over 50% of global GDP. So the US has an enormous amount of leverage here, right? And as well as you've probably heard of the Marshall Plan, where the US gave money or lent money to the European countries to rebuild. So that was part of that. And the Bretton Woods system was that the economic side of it was that there would be a gold standard, but it would be linked to the dollar. So every dollar was redeemable for gold, and then the world's trade currency became the dollar, right? Backed by gold at the time, and this was supposed to get rid of some of the inherent problems of having gold as your currency, where you can't expand the money supply, right? And expanding the money supply, you need to do that as an economy grows, right? Or otherwise it restricts growth. Okay. That was the sort of economic underpinnings. And so out of Bretton Woods came the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, or the GATT at that time, right? So they're setting up the trade and commercial financial architecture of this new phase, right? It was really amazing. And the US allowed all the rest of the world, it allowed them to run a deficit with the US economy. It allowed the rest of the world to run a trade surplus with the US, right? So even though Trump and the current debate is about the US's trade deficits, the US has always run a trade deficit with the rest of the world, right? That's how Europe and Japan and China got back on its feet, right? Well, not China, sorry, but the rest of the world was able to put up tariffs, protect or give an incentive, give an advantage to local industry to rebuild and sell, not into their own markets, because their markets are destroyed, right? Into the US market, the only market that survived, right? And rebuild that way and get this global currency, the dollar, to buy the goods that they needed and to rebuild. And it really did work amazingly. So, because the Cold War kicked off straight away, and the Russian Empire expanded into the Soviet Union's empire and looked enormously menacing, right? The advantage, the home ground advantage of being there compared to the US trying to defend Western Europe was significant and drove a lot of military policy and strategy. But what happened at this time? So at the Bretton Woods conference and around it was this more strategic military geopolitical stuff happening, while in it was all this sort of economic talk. But around it, the US is building an alliance by bribing everyone, saying, look, Japan, you went to war because you couldn't get oil, you couldn't buy the stuff you needed, right? We will let you do that. You can buy and sell to anyone, right? And we will patrol the seas for, we'll stop other countries stealing your goods ships, which has been happening for all of sailing history, right? But now the US, with the only navy standing, has said, look, we will patrol all the sea lanes. You can buy and sell to anyone. And Japan thinking, you've just given us everything that we fought a war to get, right? you defeated us, we lost the war, and we got everything that we wanted, right? Other than being, completely devastated. But the US has said, look, we're going to try something new. We're going to try free trade, right? And we're going to patrol the sea lanes, and we'll even lend you money. And let you run a trade surplus with us so you can rebuild. And through these moves, the US has built an alliance to defeat the Soviet Union and win the Cold War. Right? So all this is happening in the late 40s and 50s. And it works, right? Like global trade just takes off. Agriculture and goods, and you can see here, you've got this first wave, second wave of globalization, and then you've gone into hyper-globalization. There was, this graph has been cut off, but there was a brief period of some free trade before World War I, mainly between England and France. They were the first to sign a free trade agreement ever, right? And but that all fell apart with World War I, and then severe protectionism between the wars, and those trading blocs are blamed for starting the wars, right? Because countries couldn't get what they needed, right? So not much choice, right? It's not justifying, what the Nazis did, but from a geopolitical point of view, it's all about accessing resources. And the US bribes everyone, saying, "Look, you can have that. Germany, you can buy and sell everything you need," right? So what that also meant was global oil supplies had to be maintained. Oil exports, especially out of the Gulf region, right, has got the largest, deposits of oil in the world, and especially because not only did oil become crucial for rebuilding the world's economy, right? You can't really have free trade if you haven't got oil to run ships and get everything to everyone. But also the US became dependent upon Middle Eastern oil because they, in the late 1940s, the US became a net importer of petroleum and refined oil. So the US, as well as having all these bases, if you look at the bottom right, all these bases all over the world, they're focused on defending Europe, but they're also focused on maintaining the exports out of the Middle East, right? And particularly out of Saudi Arabia after Iran, after the Iranian Revolution in the late 70s, and particularly their presence kept a lid on the traditional religious rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Right? So the technology of oil extraction, fairly simple. Let me play this little clip for you.
was a complicated preface to how these massive pumps actually work to remove oil from underground. Attached to the horse head is something called a sucker rod, which moves up and down in the well hole. There are two stages of the pumping process, the upstroke and the downstroke. Simple enough. On the upstroke, the derrick pulls the rod up from the bottom of the well to the top of its range of movement. There's a valve attached to the bottom of the sucker rod, known as the riding valve, and another at the bottom of the well, known as the standing valve. On the upstroke, the riding valve is closed and the standing valve is opened, allowing oil from the source to be drawn up into the well. Then, on the downstroke, the riding valve opens and the standing valve closes, putting the oil from that stroke on the other side of the riding valve. Repeating this process over and over again.
So this kind of technology leaves a big footprint, right? So you can see this is Los Angeles and Bakersfield in California. Fairly slow process, but steady and pretty cheap, right? It's not hugely expensive to use these sucker pumps. However, as oil reserves dwindled and wells ran dry, much harder deposits began to be tapped because oil starts to get more expensive, and these sort of platforms, right, these deep sea ones, incredibly expensive, right, billions. And that's not even taking into account the Iraq invasion that was obviously motivated by bringing their sanctioned oil back to the world market, right? Like there was a big motivation of that. And then maybe even Iran's oil back onto the market. That was a definite motivating factor for the US invasion of Iraq. So an enormously costly mistake, right, for everyone involved. So that aside, just looking at these deep sea platforms, just crazy expensive. But that's where we got to because oil production was dwindling out of the already tapped wells, and the global economy is booming, right? And there, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was really serious people estimating that we were gonna reach a point of peak oil really soon, right? And that doesn't mean we run out of oil. It means the global demand for oil gets beyond the ability of the global oil exporters to meet, right? And as soon as you have a shortage, right, even if you're only short 1 barrel a day or something, that means that someone has to go without. And that means that there will be a bidding war for the rest of the oil, right? And so, which would send global oil prices through the roof and cripple not only the US economy because it's a net importer, but also the world, right? And so here we've got located in the North Atlantic, east of Newfoundland and Canada, the Iberia, massive thing, 45,000 tons. And to cope with the Arctic conditions, it's surrounded by an ice wall that's made from 16 concrete teeth. The structure was designed to withstand a collision with a 1 million ton iceberg. It's only got 2 drill shafts. They go approximately 2.5 kilometers deep, right? And this is on the right is the Urquhart oil platform. It is the largest in the world, weighing over 200,000 tonnes. It's located in the oil fields off the Russian Pacific coast. So these are not only are they deep sea, but they have to manage with ice and icebergs, right? Just insanely expensive to get this oil. But that's where we're at, right? But then this happened.
The initial steps are the same as for any conventional well. A hole is drilled straight down using freshwater-based fluids, which cools the drill bit, carries the rock cuttings back to the surface, and stabilizes the wall of the well bore. Once the hole extends below the deepest freshwater aquifer, the drill pipe is removed and replaced with steel pipe, called surface casing. Next, cement is pumped down the casing. When it reaches the bottom, it is pumped down and then back up between the casing and the borehole wall, creating an impermeable additional protective barrier between the well bore and any freshwater sources. In some cases, depending on the geology of the area and the depth of the well, additional casing sections may be run and, like surface casing, are then cemented in place to ensure no movement of fluids or gas between those layers and the groundwater sources. What makes drilling for hydrocarbons in a shale formation unique is the necessity to drill horizontally. Vertical drilling continues to a depth called the kickoff point. This is where the wellbore begins curving to become horizontal. One of the advantages of horizontal drilling is that it's possible to drill several wells from only one drilling pad, minimizing the impact to the surface environment. When the targeted distance is reached, the drill pipe is removed, and additional steel casing is inserted through the full length of the wellbore. Once again, the casing is cemented in place. For some horizontal developments, new technology in the form of sliding sleeves and mechanical isolation devices replace cement in the creation of isolations along the wellbore. Once the drilling is finished and the final casing has been installed, the drilling rig is removed and preparations are made for the next steps, well completion. The first step in completing a well is the creation of a connection between the final casing and the reservoir rock. This consists of lowering a specialized tool called a perforating gun, which is equipped with shaped explosive charges, down to the rock layer containing oil or natural gas. This perforating gun is then fired, which creates holes through the casing, cement, and into the target rock. These perforating holes connect the reservoir and the wellbore. Since these perforations are only a few inches long and are performed more than a mile underground, the entire process is imperceptible on the surface. The perforation gun is then removed in preparation for the next step, hydraulic fracturing. The process consists of pumping a mixture of mostly water and sand, plus a few chemicals, under controlled conditions into deep underground reservoir formations. The chemicals are generally for lubrication, to keep bacteria from forming, and help carry the sand. These chemicals typically range in concentrations from 0.1 to 0.5% by volume and help to improve the performance of the stimulation. This stimulation fluid is sent to trucks that pump the fluid into the wellbore and out through the perforations that were noted earlier. This process creates fractures in the oil and gas reservoir rock. The sand in the frac fluid remains in these fractures in the rock and keeps them open when the pump pressure is relieved. This allows the previously trapped oil or natural gas to flow to the wellbore more easily. This initial stimulation segment is then isolated with a specially designed plug, and the perforating guns are used to perforate the next stage. This stage is then hydraulically fractured in the same manner. This process is repeated along the entire horizontal section of the well, which can extend several miles. Once the stimulation is complete, the isolation plugs are drilled out and production begins. Initially water and then natural gas or oil flows into the horizontal casing and up the wellbore. In the course of initial production of the well, approximately 15 to 50% of the fracturing fluid is recovered. This fluid is either recycled to be used on other fracturing operations or safely disposed of according to government regulations. The whole process of developing a well typically takes from 3 to 5 months. a few weeks to prepare the site, 4 to 6 weeks to drill the well, and then 1 to 3 months of completion activities, which includes 1 to 7 days of stimulation. But this 3 to 5 month investment can result in a well that will produce oil or natural gas for 20 to 40 years or more. The initial steps are the same as for
So these fracking pads or drilling pads. Initially, they started out at going down to 180 meters sideways, right, horizontally, 180 meters. But very quickly, they improved the process and got up to 1,860 meters, so nearly 2 kilometers, right? And then they worked out how to do multiple drill lines from one platform, right? So you're going nearly 2 kilometers and using the same infrastructure at the surface, right? So very cheap, right? It's no more costly really to have one pipeline than dozens, right? But the output it increases exponentially. And then by mid 2016, started 2017, they've got it out to close to 2.5 kilometers laterally, and you've got, instead of separate downpipes, they're all coming through the same one drill site, right? So just amazing, right? So you can have up to 29, I think, is the pipes per platform, right? And so you can see that for a very minimal footprint, this can do an area of 5 kilometers, right? So this field here, this food-producing field, doesn't need to be destroyed by all the platforms that you saw in Los Angeles, right? And California, where to get the oil, you've got to do hundreds, thousands of oil wells to get out a single deposit, whereas this, you only need one. And so not only the environmental impact is better, but cheap, mate. Right? So Daniel Yergin, an energy historian, basically, he's quoted as saying that it takes 10 billion and 5 to 10 years to launch a deep water project, right? But it only takes 10 million and 20 days to drill for shale oil, right? So the cost differences are just extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. So you're not gonna see any deep water projects really from now on, right? Or at least it would have to be an extremely good deposit. And each fracking multilateral drilling platform can have 29 pipes, right? Whereas a normal deep sea water platform only has 2 shafts, right? So the fracking can produce up to 4 times the amount of oil that a deep sea project can. So this is truly a revelation, a revolution, right? And it's sort of been happening without anyone really noticing. This is extraordinary. So the result has been a massive increase in US production of natural gas, non-methane liquids and condensate, which are used in producing all sorts of key industrial products like plastics and lubricants and things like that, and crude oil, right? And so you can see here the red, the pink, the green, and the brown are all from fracking, right? Like that increase. And you can see that the increase really starts from 2005, when fracking was being experimented with and started to become more widely used in the US, right? By small time operations, right? So it's only 10 million, right? And that sounds like a lot of money, but compared to 10 billion, I can't. So suddenly you've got all these small operators experimenting with processes and taking risks and getting rewarded, right? And you see this exponential growth, right? And this is a very interesting graph from Peter Zion, where you can see that in 2012, US shale full cycle break-even cost was the highest in the world, right? Almost $90 a barrel. And so that means the price that they have to get is above $90 to make a profit, right? The full cycle break-even cost is what the price of oil needs to be above for a company to make a profit. And so in 2012, US shale oil is the most expensive in the world, and prices were that high in those sort of boom years, right? So confluence of events made this whole thing possible. But you can see in a very short time, so 5 years of experimenting and mistakes made and learning and getting the processes right reduces that full cycle break-even cost all the way down to cheaper than the entire world except Saudi Arabia, right? And so I said Saudi Arabia's oil is very close to the surface, and its viscosity is right so that it pumps easily and it's processed easily, and so very cheap. And so the break-even price of Saudi Arabia has been estimated by serious people to be around $34. We don't really know because Saudi Arabia doesn't tell people those sort of things. Well, actually they do. They say things like they can go all the way down to $10 a barrel and still make a profit. But the way that OPEC works, Saudi Arabia sort of scares all the rest into reducing output to get the higher prices, because otherwise, if a price war happens, Saudi Arabia says they can win. So there is an incentive for them to lie about this stuff. So we haven't known, and we've people have thought it's around $34. However, just recently, so April of 2019, I think, they put out a perspective for selling a percentage of the company. I can't remember. So Saudi Aramco. So that prospectus has to give all the business case for the company, right? If they want to sell 49% of the company, they need to tell prospective buyers exactly what's going on. And so from that, we learn it's the most profitable business in the world, right? But also we learn that they struggle to make a profit when oil is at $40 a barrel. So $40 might actually be their break even, and which would put them above US shale oil. So even with the move that Saudi Arabia and Russia have done recently, where they've increased production to oversupply the market and drive prices down, in in what is thought to be a move to try and bankrupt all the US shale producers, we might find out that actually US shale producers can produce cheaper than Saudi Arabia. So we'll see. Though that being said, if the Saudi Arabians would have a much bigger war chest to be able to cope with losing money per barrel. So what does all this mean? Well, for a start, it means the US has become a net energy exporter for the first time since the 1940s this year, right, in 2020. So what might happen in a world where the US no longer needs allies to fight the Cold War? So that's one. And it no longer needs external supplies of oil to keep its economy functioning, right? Like those two things are so to win the Cold War and to keep oil flowing was the main motivating strategic goal for the US from 1945 onwards, right? Until now. So the Cold War disappeared in 1990, and now the need for Middle Eastern oil has disappeared March 2020. Right? So what might that mean? Well, for the first thing is that the US can now start using all of its considerable leverage to reverse the rest of the world running trade surpluses with it. So hence the trade war with China, but also with the EU and a whole bunch of people. Australia had to get on the phone and beg to be excluded from the trade wars, right? From the new tariffs. So the US no longer needs allies to win a war, right? So we can expect a lot of tough negotiating to continue, whether it's Trump or not, right? It doesn't matter if it's the Democrats or the GOP in power in the US. This is the geopolitical deck of cards that whoever's president will have in their hand. And so from that point of view, you can see that why would they allow countries to have higher tariffs than they do and run trade surpluses with them if they don't need them? They don't need to be friends anymore. They don't need to be allies. And it also means that the US can wash its hands of Middle Eastern problems. Right? That they look quite serious about stopping Iran going nuclear, because if the region goes nuclear and there's an exchange of nuclear weapons, then the fallout from that could hurt the US. But beyond that, they don't care. It is extremely unlikely that US troops will be sent to die to protect Saudi Arabian global oil supplies ever again, right? Or to try and boost Middle Eastern output, right? So all of this enormous expense, the reason, right? Middle Eastern oil, the reason has ceased to be a factor for the US, right? And so just as an example, the US has had a policy for 30 years that there must always be at least one aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf area at all times. And when they are relieved within sight of the replacement aircraft carrier, and that aircraft carriers in particular are able to exert power inland, whereas a fleet of destroyers can't really do that. They can stand off and fight, but you can have it's a moving airport, it's a moving airbase, incredibly powerful, destructive piece of machinery, right? And so they've always had one in the Gulf region, since the end of World War II. Indeed, in fact, its massive US base for its Fifth Fleet is in Bahrain, right? So right in the Gulf. So US presence there has kept a blanket, has smothered regional conflict, right? I mean, it started a lot too, but the traditional rivalry between the US and Iran has been smothered. But in December 2016, the Nimitz-class aircraft carrier that was stationed in the region, I think it was the Dwight Eisenhower, I could be wrong about that, but so that sailed home for leave without being relieved by another aircraft carrier for many months, right? And now having long periods with no aircraft carrier in the region has become the norm, and the gaps between patrols is getting longer. And there is serious debate about closing the Bahrain base altogether and disbanding the Fifth Fleet entirely. Like from both sides, like really serious talks about it, right? The US doesn't care about Middle East oil anymore. In fact, as an exporter, a war in the Gulf region would send oil prices to the moon and benefit the US enormously. So for the first time since World War II, the incentives for the US propping up the global free trade order has reversed. Right? It actually benefits the US if it falls apart. And another reason why it would benefit the US if it fell apart, if free trade stopped, if oil stopped, or at least everything became much more expensive and dangerous and difficult, is that out of all the developed countries, all the leading developed countries, the US is the least exposed to international trade, right? So 15% of its imports and 10% of its exports are as a percentage of its GDP, right? So imports only make up 15% of their GDP, and exports only 10%, right? So only 10%. That's extraordinary, right? And if you included Mexico and Canada, right? So you don't need a navy to protect that trade, right? That's all internal to NAFTA. Then 33% of US exports go to Mexico and Canada, and 27% of imports from Mexico and Canada go to the US, right? Well, 27% of US imports are from Mexico and Canada. So if you include that, trade within NAFTA, then imports fall to less than 5%, and exports, as a percentage of US GDP, exports make up less than 3.3%. That is nothing. Like I still find that I've checked these figures because I find it so extraordinary. So it's never been about making money for the US, right? This whole global free trade whole thing, it's not been about making money. In fact, they've run a trade deficit with the entire world. It's been about winning the Cold War and keeping oil flowing, right? bribing up an alliance to win the Cold War and to keep the oil flowing, neither of which they care about anymore. So, and it's also protecting Western Europe is no longer a priority for the US, right? We can see that in the hands-off approach it's had with dealing with a newly aggressive Russia, right? Troops are being withdrawn out of Europe. They're not being sent, right? Which is extraordinary. Like, if this is the Cold War, then any little move by Russia would have had nuclear bombers flying along the edge of the country, and brigades, troops being sent in, new defense treaties being signed. Every little move by the Russians was met with fierce pushback, and now the US doesn't care. It's extraordinary. We are living in really amazing times. And so what's that? So what does this mean for the Indo-Pacific region? So a war between Saudi Arabia and Iran is a distinct possibility. Their proxy war is been going for decades and has been heating up. Al-Qaeda and ISIS have been created by Saudi Arabia, and the US has not made an issue of this. Even the 9 Saudi Arabian citizens that were involved in the 9/11 attack, none of that has been brought up because the US needed Saudi Arabian oil. That is no longer the case. So, and Saudi Arabia knows this, and seems to be opening a new front in Lebanon, where they've invited the president or prime minister and basically kidnapped him and said, "Look, you've got to resign on live TV because he was sponsored. He is Iranian backed." So the proxy war is serious, and the religious Shiite Sunni divide between them is centuries old and very deep and hot. So a war is a distinct possibility. Let me play this clip for you.
از شما بزرگترها آمدن و شاخشون شکسته شد. حالا شما که چیزی نیستید.
امن رقم 2216.
We will not continue down a path whose predictable conclusion is more violence, more terror.
A battle for regional hegemony has been played out by Saudi Arabia and Iran for decades. Hostilities and proxy wars as both sides try to leverage influence in the region. But new developments have seen tensions between them escalate. Tehran is accused of ordering a ballistic missile from Yemen towards Riyadh. The Saudis are calling it a potential act of war. Could this latest power play turn into a confrontation? An alleged attempted Houthi missile attack on a Saudi airport, the resignation of the Lebanese Prime Minister, and a sudden purge of royals, politicians and prominent businessmen has consolidated power for the Gulf Kingdom's crown prince. He's made sweeping reforms and controls the military and political structure of Saudi Arabia. Is a confrontation with Iran part of a plan for Middle East dominance? Saudi Arabia's regional influence has tested the long-standing diplomatic relationship between Iran and Lebanon. Lebanon's Prime Minister Saad Hariri's resignation was live on Saudi television, and it's claimed he stepped down under duress.
هذا بيعطينا هذا المعطى أو هذه المعطيات بيعطينا استنتاج واضح وقطعي مو احتمال أن الاستقالة كانت قرارا سعوديا أملي على الرئيس سعد الحريري وأجبر عليه وأن الاستقالة لم تكن نيته ولا رغبته ولا إرادته ولا قراره.
His departure is seen as a Saudi attempt to weaken Iran as its influence deepens in Syria and Iraq. So what happens next? Saudi Arabia, Israel and the Trump administration all have a common enemy in Iran and are prepared to take military action against Iran's proxy ally, Hezbollah. Is Saudi Arabia using Lebanon to open a new front against Iran? Can the kingdom extend its power further beyond its own borders?
And it's recently escalated to direct attacks on oil tankers in the Gulf. Okay, so this is what we're talking about, right? If this happens, if it continues to happen, it will send oil prices to the moon, right? Let me play this clip for you.
Two tankers apparently attacked, possibly by torpedoes or mines, in the Gulf of Oman. The crews forced to abandon ship as the massive tankers burned. One ship, owned by a Norwegian company, was transporting a petroleum product to Taiwan. The other, operated by a Japanese firm, was transporting chemicals from Saudi Arabia to Singapore. Just before the incident, both ships had transited the Strait of Hormuz, the strategically important shipping lane near Iran. It's not known for certain who is behind the attacks. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is blaming Iran.
This assessment is based on intelligence, the weapons used, the level of expertise needed to execute the operation, recent similar Iranian attacks on shipping, and the fact that no proxy group operating in the area has the resources and proficiency to act with such a high degree of sophistication.
The attacks happened as Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was in Tehran for talks, hoping to ease tensions between Iran and the U.S. Iran has denied responsibility for the attack. Foreign Minister Javad Zarif tweeted this: reported attacks on Japan-related tankers occurred while Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was meeting with Ayatollah Khamenei for extensive and friendly talks. Suspicious doesn't begin to describe what likely transpired this morning. As tensions run high in the region, the UN is calling for calm.
I strongly condemned any attack against civilian vessels. Facts must be established and responsibilities clarified. And if there is something the world cannot afford, is a major confrontation in the Gulf region.
Last month, 4 other tankers were attacked near the Strait of Hormuz. A UAE-led investigation found those attacks were part of a sophisticated and coordinated operation, likely by a state actor, but that report did not say what country may have been responsible. U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo says Iran is also to blame for those attacks, but the U.S. has presented no concrete evidence. Jim Spellman, CGTN, Washington.
And this kind of thing has happened before, right? Let me play this clip for you.
An oil tanker runs the gauntlet of air attacks in the Gulf War. TVI sails with the crew. It's a voyage through the area where 14 oil tankers have now been hit by air attack from Iran or Iraq. The most dangerous place for merchant shipping today is the Gulf, surrounded by the Gulf War. One of the biggest oil terminals there is the Iranian one at Karg Island, and today there are reports that the Iranians may be forced to close it to shipping. This follows the attack early yesterday in which a Swiss supertanker was set on fire by an Iraqi missile. 7 of the crew are missing, believed dead. What's happening is that the war on land between Iran and Iraq is spilling over into the sea, with Western tankers being the sitting targets for both sides. Once through the entrance, the Straits of Hormuz, the oil tankers face a problem, regardless of their destination. If they're going to pick up oil from Iran, on the right-hand side of the Gulf, they face the threat of attack by Iraqi planes armed with Exocet missiles. If they're going to the oil terminals on the other side, they face attack by Iranian planes. From the Gulf, this report by Julian Mannion.
The Arab oil fields. It is 10 years since the oil embargo brought Western Europe to its knees. Today, anxious eyes are once again turned towards the Persian Gulf, which still provides 20% of the free world's supplies. Missiles against tankers are the weapons that both sides are using to try and break the stalemate in their war on land. Iraq began with Exocets. Iran has hit back at ships like this one, the chemical venture. This is the kind of sight that has sent tremors through finance ministries and stock exchanges all over the world. Oil from the Gulf is still vital, and getting it out depends on confidence. The confidence of tanker crews, the confidence of owners, and the confidence of the insurance companies that back them up. With their attacks and counterattacks on Gulf shipping, Iran and Iraq are playing double or quits for very high stakes indeed. At a small port just outside the Persian Gulf, we prepared to join a tanker called the Berger Arrow.
Confidence Futura, come in please.
Yes, Arrow.
Oh yes sir, it's just to inform you that we got the Thames television crew joining your vessel.
Okay, thank you very much. We will be ready to take them, so thank you.
On a tug belonging to the Gulf Agency, our equipment was prepared for transfer to the Berger Arrow, a 50,000-ton vessel that carries liquid petroleum gas, or LPG, a highly volatile product of the Gulf oil fields. We had been invited on board by the vessel's Norwegian owners, who were worried by the situation in the Gulf, but had decided to go ahead with the voyage to Qatar and Saudi Arabia. The ship's crew were Norwegian, promised double their normal pay for working in the Gulf. In their hands, a highly complex refrigerated tanker that could, if things went wrong, become a floating bomb. After midnight, we began to move through the Straits of Hormuz. The captain and navigator plotted the ship's course through the channel that is the entrance to the Gulf. The ship's radar screens showed that the Berger Arrow was virtually alone. But next morning, a tug came alongside to take off 2 members of the ship's crew, for whom no assurances were enough. Atla Adland, who normally works in the engine room, had decided that no amount of extra money was going to make him stay for the rest of the voyage.
So this has happened before, right? But a war between Saudi Arabia and Iran would be much worse for global oil supplies than the war between Iran and Iraq was. Because Saudi Arabia is by far the world's largest exporter of oil. And so if their shipments couldn't get out, then that would take 20% of the global oil supply offline. And if Iran and Kuwait, they probably wouldn't be able to get their shipments out of the Gulf as well. So that would be 35% of the global oil supply taken out of the system. And once you have even 1 barrel short of global demand, then the price gets bid up, right? So you would have, and America will be energy independent. Well, they are now, right? But China and the Southeast Asian countries and the whole South China Sea region, Indo-Pacific, 80% of their oil comes from the Gulf region, right? So you take that offline, someone has to go without. And it is very easy to imagine that a tanker war in the Gulf would actually lead to a tanker war in the Indo-Pacific, where countries that only have a few days of oil left before their economy has to shut down, or they only have a few days of oil for their navies to operate still, and they see slow-moving oil tankers going past, it's easy to imagine them reaching out and taking them. And once one goes, then you have a regional war, right? You sinking each other's tankers, or preferably stealing them. And so what would have to happen is countries would have to send escorts with their tankers to go and get the oil, protect it from attack, and then bring it back and protect it from being stolen. So, recipe for, if the US withdraws from the Gulf, where they have been suppressing the competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran for since the end of the Second World War, we have a recipe for a regional war in the South China Sea region. So that is an explanation for China's very aggressive moves in the South China Sea, the building out of the reefs and making military bases, and everyone else doing it as well, right? And you see all the powers in the area building out fleets of attack submarines, right? And so you have a real powder keg here that could very easily lead to regional war, because energy security is at the heart of a nation's ability to function. So on that cheery note, I hope I'll leave it there. I hope you found that interesting, and I'll talk to you next lecture.